Hey everyone, this is my book review of Careless People by Sarah Wynn-Williams. This is a book talking about her experience working at Facebook in the first, I could probably say 4 to 5 years or so. And she starts off as being someone from New Zealand who's really interested in kind of global policy and kind of Facebook's ability to have a really big impact across the world, even before the executive team can recognize it. So she is so excited, she literally calls them and tries to apply for a position that doesn't exist and tries to convince them that they need to create a position about kind of the person managing between different governments because Facebook's going to be so important. And she goes from being super excited and eventually gets in, and then you pretty much just see what happens in the corporate world. And I think that personally for me, being somebody in Silicon Valley at Stanford, right, in the heart of everything, this book really, I think, opened my eyes to the more darker reality of yes, a lot of people here create technologies that do have really profound impacts and are able to connect a lot of people. But something I like to think about a lot is that nothing is black and white, right? So there's no extremes of anything. So for Facebook, right, it does a lot of good things, it does a lot of bad things. And too often, you have to understand how the incentive of these people works, right? Because if you run a company, you're never going to be listing out all the bad things you do. So all you hear a lot of times in the media are the best things. And the CEOs, the top executives just repeat the best things again and again and again. And the only time they ever talk about any bad things that they're responsible for is if somebody else brings it up. And then usually they respond to it with a very, very small kind of comment, or they just lie about it. And this book, unfortunately, just it just shows how some people who have so much power and so much money literally just don't care about certain things, which is, okay, they're not purposely trying to do harm necessarily, but sometimes they just don't care, and they don't care enough, even when if they just did a little bit, just a little tiny something that could have prevented stuff. For example, there's a situation she talks about in Myanmar where it's kind of like Facebook was responsible for the genocide in a particular way because it was supporting the military group, because it didn't have control of the stuff that it actually put out. So it wasn't really censoring anything. And also, it didn't even have control of Facebook because there was some weird technical thing where the Facebook that was there was not their Facebook. And so they actually couldn't control that. And even though she tried to ask management to do something about it, they wouldn't do anything about it because nobody cared about Myanmar because it's just a small country or something, and they're all focused on China. And then you see how all they care about is growth, right? So Facebook literally agrees with the Chinese government to have a huge backdoor kind of situation where the Chinese government can just remove any people posting that they want to at any time, and Facebook is just goes along with it. Now, I don't know really what followed that because I'm sure Facebook, is not being used there currently, but I think that this really just points out, I think a lot of times, right, we don't really have, as an individual, we don't have information as to what's going on between the hottest, tech company and how it's changing the world. What is going on behind the scenes? Because you think about it, she has to write this book. She has to become a whistleblower. She has to probably get sued, get death threats, all this stuff, right? Just to write this so I can read it and then understand what's going on. And of course the lag is that's 10 years ago, right? But I think the only way to really get insight into this kind of situation is you have to think about incentives, right? So you have to put yourself, and I think this is something easier for me because I have heard a lot of experiences of people who are starting companies or, doing other things in the Silicon Valley. I've taken some classes on it. So I have a little bit of that perspective. And I think just a little bit of common sense is enough to realize why this happens. I won't go into it here, and maybe I'll start making some videos about how you can use incentives to get a very rough estimate of a lot of kind of pretty correct things. Of course, right, if I use the power of incentives to understand why Mark Zuckerberg, right, won't do something or will do something, why is it so willing to compromise on things to get into China? Well, it's because China has a lot of people. And if Facebook can do that, then it's going to get a lot of people, and then it's going to make a bunch of money, and then it's going to do really well, and it's going to become prominent. It's getting a lot of power, right? Another situation could be why is it focusing on, targeting teens so much? And why is it trying to do very immoral things with, advertising? And the reason is because advertising makes a lot of money. And because of that, they're going to make a huge amount of money. Why is it that, you know, in the corporate world, why do people just hire their friends? Because they know their friends, they trust their friends, they want to have a good time. And so they hire their friends, even if they're not really qualified. Why is it that they lie? Because if they lie, right, they can just defer responsibility to somebody else. And if they tell the truth, they're going to get fired. So like you can understand all these kind of problems that happen, like why pretty much the Sarah in this story gets like sexually assaulted by her boss, by her superiors, even by like a woman almost, which is very like unusual, I think. Why, you know, her superiors above her are technically using her for their own personal gain and their side projects. You know, why she's forced on maternity leave to still respond to stuff and like to have to travel right after. And I think this is like one of the broader things that I've realized too is like, you know, the problem with not being responsible for, let's say, your own source of income is that that creates a situation where people have power over you. One of the big problems is that one of her superiors pretty much is like a predator, kind of, you could say that. He just makes her very uncomfortable and like physically like touches her and stuff, right? And she's like literally married, which is like terrible, and she does not like this at all. But the reason he has power over her is because he is buddy with all the rest of management, and so they're not going to do anything to hurt him, and he controls her pay in a way, right? And so if you think about it, she has children. She moved to California to be closer for her job because the team pretty much, in a way, required it. Mark didn't say it directly, but he pretty much required it. And it's pretty clear that he wants her to be closer. Then, you know, her children, they bought a house there. They don't have a ton of money, so they can't just, you know, and like housing in the Bay Area is very expensive. I know from just like living here, right? So you think about it, okay, house. She has a husband, but he's not making a ton of money. They have children in school, right? So there's enormous switching costs to trying to do something, like trying to get yourself out of the situation. So you see all these points kind of converge. And yeah, maybe I will make videos about this, but like when you see all these lines and these incentives converge, this is why the sexual harassment problem has been such a problem for such a long time, because the people with power are the people doing it. And then everybody else, oh, you're really going to be like, oh yeah, I quit. Okay, you quit. You lost all your potential equity because you were there before Facebook IPO'd, which would have been millions and millions of dollars, right? Now you quit, and who knows if they're going to write a letter of recommendation for your next job. You quit, or you're going to sell your house and now move your kids out of school and your partner to somewhere else, right? So you see all these things, and this is how you understand, and this is how I think a lot of people should really start to understand the world, because through this lens, you know, I'm not saying this you know, story is any better. I mean, it's terrible. But you start to understand why it happens. And as such, you can start to realize, like, for example, Facebook, 2016, Trump election. Facebook hires a guy from like the Republican side who's like a senator or something as part of their payroll. And this is like huge problems, right? But it's clear that like they're, for example, like for Mark Zuckerberg's own Facebook page, they're like manipulating the algorithm because they can, you know, and they're manipulating the algorithm because like people are supporting them and people are paying them. And so like you can start to see these reoccurring themes. And I'm not talking about just Facebook. I want to broaden this to other stuff, right? You see this with AI companies. Even though, you know, I read that book about AI, what was it? Empire of AI, Karen Howe. Make sure you read that. But I have a video on it, so you can also check that out on my channel. But like, you read this stuff and you realize, oh, okay, so it's pretty much like any sort of company, and especially a tech company, because they all have this very, you know, large impact in a short amount of time kind of behavior, right? We can generalize. We can take the story of Facebook. We can take the story of OpenAI. We can take the story of all these huge tech companies and assume that not everybody in there is a predator. Not everybody there is propagating sexual harassment, right? But we can assume that the company is lying to people sometimes when they talk. The company is lying when they're talking to the press. The company is lying when they're under oath inside Congress. And that the only reason you find out this stuff is because later, is down the line. There's like a definitely 10, 20-year delay. This even happens with the U.S. government. There's times when the U.S. government goes into different countries in Africa and assassinates leaders, and then it says it didn't do it. And then like 30 years later, the CIA reports get declassified, and then it's released that they actually did it, right? So it's like, in this day and age, unfortunately, I don't think you can trust what a lot of people have to say. And instead of blindly trusting certain people, you have to just look at where their incentives are, right? Where do they make money? What would they most be like what are the things they most care about, right? And like, that's not going to be perfect, right? Are there some good people on Facebook? Of course. Are there some absolutely horrific people on Facebook? Of course. Is that the same with any other company? Of course, right? But like, you have to realize that pretty much most of the people in power at the top, right? If you read any books about human nature, you realize power has a very corrupting, aspect. So then you can imagine all these CEOs who think that they're going to be in control of the world going forward. They have a very kind of corrupted worldview. They may become very narcissistic. It may not start out like this, but power really corrupts your mind. If you look at past dictators, right, it's really the same thing with a lot of these, technology companies moving forward. And it's just important to realize that if this is the platform that you're going to spend most of your life on, watching videos, commenting things, seeing stuff, like, you need to understand that they are going to do whatever they can to like suck the most life out of you. I mean, this is like kind of the peak of commodifying everybody, right? And in capitalism, maybe I'll make a video about that. I don't know. But you just have to just really, really like understand incentives well, because we're going to be always at an information loss, right? We're lucky she makes a book about this. She probably has endured crazy hardship to make this book, but we're not going to get a book on every single company, and we're not going to get it in the time that we need it. If anything, I need a book on like all the different AI companies right now. I need all the dirty secrets, but we're not going to get that. We won't get it until something bad happens. And by then it's far too late. So I think that, it's important to like start to just realize why people act in a certain way. And then you can start to kind of see that their behavior is sort of predictable and generalizable. Can I guarantee you that like every executive is going to lie? No, there'll be some deviations, right? For example, if you look at like Joe Kent, the guy who was against, like the Iran war thing, and he got fired, right? That's very similar to what happens in companies, right? Any people who are outspoken, right? They get fired, they get deemed uncredible, because why on earth would a big company want to say somebody who's saying the worst things about it is actually saying the truth? Is there ever in 100,000 situations where that happens? Is that ever going to happen? No. So by kind of making that understanding, you can start to piece together, because in this day and age when people are being paid maybe to post certain things and it's not actually their opinion and you can't really trust a lot, you have to do a lot more critical thinking on your own. And I think this is one of those moments when you have to really think about this and think about why somebody would act like this. And unfortunately, I don't think we can give people the benefit of the doubt anymore. It's kind of like we've gone past that point. So that was my take on the book. I think it was really eye-opening. I think it's really made me question a lot of technology, and really, even though things start out idealistic, the monsters that they end up becoming. If you have any other questions, put them in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next books.